The Villain Omeaga's Second Fate, a dark BL reincarnation romance. Character descriptions: Lucien Ardent, the reborn villain Omeaga. Lucien Ardent was a contradiction that unsettled everyone who looked at him. He possessed a beauty so sharp it felt dangerous. His hair was long and silver, not dull like old metal, but luminous like moonlight, reflecting on still water. It flowed down his back in soft strands that servants brushed every morning with careful hands, afraid of pulling too hard. His eyes were violet, not bright or cheerful, but deep and cold, like twilight skies before a storm. His skin was pale, almost porcelain, untouched by sun or hardship. But the most dangerous thing about Lucien was his scent. Omeaga pheromones always carried sweetness, but Lucien's scent was strange. Night jasmine, rain on cold stone. A quiet sweetness hiding something darker. To most alphas, it felt intoxicating. To the wrong alpha, it could become obsession. In the original story of this world, Lucien Ardent was remembered as the villainous Omeaga Duke who tried to overthrow the crown. A manipulator, a traitor, and eventually, a corpse. Because the man who killed him was the most powerful alpha in the Empire. King Adrian Blackthorn, the Alpha King. Adrian Blackthorn did not simply rule the Empire, he dominated it. He was tall, towering over most men with broad shoulders, built by years of war rather than luxury. His hair was black, dark as ink, falling slightly over his forehead when he removed his crown. His eyes were the most striking feature. Golden. Not soft gold like sunlight, but burning gold like molten metal inside a forge. They were the eyes of someone who had killed enemies on battlefields and never regretted it. His scent carried the strength of an alpha who had never been challenged. Winter forests, iron, storm winds. In the original story, Adrian was the hero, the righteous king, the man who executed Lucien Ardent for treason. And he did it without hesitation. Ardent, the brother Leon, was the opposite of Lucien. Where Lucien was cold, Leon was warm. Where Lucien's beauty felt dangerous, Leon's was comforting. Soft brown hair that fell loosely around his forehead. Golden amber eyes filled with emotion. He smiled easily. People trusted him easily. In the original timeline, Leon eventually turned against Lucien. Not because he hated him, but because Lucien pushed everyone away until there was no one left to stand beside him. Celine Ardent, the sister. Celine was beautiful in a way that made people uneasy. Her hair was long and black, darker even than Adrian's. Her eyes were crimson, a rare genetic trait within the Ardent bloodline. When she looked at someone, it felt as though she were studying them, measuring them, deciding whether they were worth keeping alive. Celine loved only one person without condition, Lucien, and that love was intense enough to become dangerous. Chapter 1. The Villain Awakens. Death had been quiet. There was no dramatic pain, no screaming, just the sound of rain against glass. Elias Vale remembered sitting inside his car as the storm swallowed the highway. He remembered headlights suddenly appearing in front of him, then darkness and silence. When consciousness returned, it did not feel like waking. It felt like surfacing from deep water. Lucien Ardent opened his eyes slowly. The first thing he noticed was the ceiling. White marble, carved with delicate floral patterns that curled across the stone like frozen vines. The second thing he noticed was the softness beneath him. Silk sheets, expensive ones. The third thing he noticed was the smell. Fresh roses, polished wood, and faint perfume drifting through the air from somewhere beyond the door. Lucien sat up slowly. His heartbeat began to accelerate, because he recognized this place, not from memory, but from a story. The bedroom of Duke Lucien Ardent. His breathing became shallow. No. He stood from the bed and walked across the room, his bare feet silent against the marble floor. A tall mirror stood near the balcony doors. When he looked into it, his world shifted. A stranger stared back, silver hair cascading over his shoulders, violet eyes staring with sharp intelligence. Beautiful, cold, aristocratic. Lucien raised a hand slowly. The reflection mirrored the movement. His voice came out as a whisper. I'm him. The villain of the novel. The Crown of Iron. Elias felt the memories of this body stirring inside his mind. Lucien's childhood. The political pressure of noble life. The suffocating expectations placed on a rare Omeaga born into power. And deeper still, another memory surfaced. The moment Lucien died in the original story. It had been winter, snow falling silently across the palace courtyard. Lucien had been kneeling in chains, and standing before him, King Adrian Blackthorn. The Alpha King had looked down at him with calm golden eyes, not hatred, not anger, just cold judgment. You chose this path, Adrian said quietly. Lucien had laughed bitterly in that moment. Then the sword fell. Elias shivered. He stepped away from the mirror slowly. That's how this story ends. But that ending belonged to the original Lucien, not him. Elias walked toward the balcony doors and pushed them open. Cold morning air rushed into the room. The Ardent estate stretched across the hills beyond the city. Gardens, stone fountains, servants moving quietly along paths. This was not fiction anymore. This was his life now. And he already knew how that life would end if he did nothing. Lucien placed both hands on the balcony railing. His mind began to analyze the situation. He knew the future. He knew the political factions. He knew which nobles would betray each other. And most importantly, he knew exactly what mistakes Lucien Ardent originally made. If I repeat those mistakes, I die. But if he changed them, perhaps the story could change too. A quiet knock came from the door. Your Grace? A servant's voice called nervously. Lucien turned slightly. Yes. The door opened slowly. A young maid stepped inside and bowed deeply. Your siblings have arrived for breakfast. Lucien paused. His siblings. Leon, Celine. Two people whose futures were tangled with his. He straightened his posture, the aristocratic habits of Lucien's body moving naturally. Tell them I'll be there shortly. The maid bowed again and left quickly. Lucien walked back to the mirror. The villain stared back at him again. This time, the reflection smiled faintly. Chapter 2. The Alpha King. Morning sunlight spread slowly across the capital of Veltharis, touching the rooftops of noble estates and the white marble towers of the imperial palace. From the highest balcony of the palace, the empire looked peaceful. But peace was a fragile illusion. Power ruled this world, and power belonged to alphas. Inside the imperial palace, the air carried the heavy scent of dominance. Alphas filled the grand war chamber. Generals in dark uniforms, nobles with sharp eyes and sharper ambitions, council members whispering quietly behind gloved hands. Their pheromones layered over each other like invisible smoke. Strong, territorial, competitive. Yet despite the presence of so many powerful men, the room remained silent, because there was only one true predator in the room. The man sitting at the head of the table. King Adrian Blackthorn, the ruler of the empire, the Alpha King. Adrian sat with one arm resting against the carved armrest of his throne-like chair. He wore no crown this morning. It sat casually beside him on the table, like an afterthought, because he didn't need it. Authority radiated from him naturally. His black hair fell slightly over his forehead, not styled for ceremony, but left loose from sleep. Even relaxed, he looked dangerous. His broad shoulders filled the dark military coat he wore, and the golden embroidery of the imperial crest shimmered softly in the sunlight. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. Golden, not soft gold like sunlight, but sharp, molten gold, like a blade pulled fresh from a forge. Eyes that had watched battlefields burn. Eyes that had judged traitors without mercy. Eyes that once watched Lucian Ardent die. A map of the northern frontier lay across the table before him. The northern territories had always been unstable. Bandit clans, border disputes, old rival kingdoms that had never fully accepted Veltheris's rule. One of the generals cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty, we have received another report from the border garrison." Adrian didn't look up from the map. "Speak." "The Northern Coalition appears to be reorganizing their forces." A murmur passed through the room. Another general leaned forward. "They may attempt a full invasion before winter." Adrian finally looked up. The golden gaze moved slowly across the room. Every man present felt their spines stiffen slightly. "Let them try." His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that made enemies nervous. At that moment a palace servant entered the room quietly and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, the noble council has begun gathering in the royal court." Adrian stood slowly. The generals immediately straightened. His height alone made him imposing, but it was the quiet confidence in his movements that truly commanded attention. "Prepare the court." The servant bowed again and hurried away. Adrian glanced once more at the map. War would come eventually. It always did. But for now, the empire had other problems, political ones. And politics was often more dangerous than war. Imperial power. Massive marble pillars stretched toward a painted ceiling that depicted the founding of the empire centuries ago. Sunlight poured through tall stained glass windows, casting colored light across the polished floor. Nobles had already begun to gather. Alphas dominated the court as usual. Powerful families, influential dukes, military leaders, their scents mixed heavily in the air. Competition, pride, dominance. A few betas stood among them. Omegas were rare here. Most noble Omegas lived quiet lives far from politics, except one. When the large doors opened, the room fell silent. King Adrian Blackthorn entered the hall. Every noble bowed deeply. "Your Majesty." Adrian walked toward the throne slowly, acknowledging the court with a small gesture of his hand. His golden eyes moved through the crowd, evaluating, observing, remembering. Adrian never forgot faces, never forgot alliances, and never forgot enemies. But then something strange happened. His gaze paused, not on an alpha, not on a military leader, on an Omega. Lucian Ardent. Lucian stood among the nobles with elegant composure. He wore a dark silver coat embroidered with the crest of the Ardent family. The color made his silver hair appear even brighter under the sunlight pouring through the windows. His posture was perfect. His expression calm, almost serene. Adrian frowned slightly. That alone was strange. Lucian Ardent was not known for calm behavior. In fact, the Duke was infamous for arrogance, sharp insults, public humiliation of rivals, dangerous political ambition. Lucian Ardent was a villain everyone in the court watched carefully. And yet, something was different. Lucian bowed respectfully as the king passed. "Your Majesty." His voice was smooth, controlled, completely polite. Adrian stopped walking. The court froze, because the king had just paused in front of the most controversial noble in the empire. Adrian studied him carefully. Silver hair, violet eyes, that strange, elegant beauty that made people uneasy. And then Adrian noticed something else. Lucian's scent. Omega pheromones were usually soft, sweet. But Lucian's scent carried something colder. Night jasmine, rain on stone. Quiet, subtle, yet strangely compelling. Adrian's instincts reacted before his mind did. His alpha senses sharpened. That scent was interesting. Lucian raised his head slightly, meeting the king's gaze without fear. A small, polite smile touched his lips. Adrian spoke slowly. Duke Ardent. Lucian inclined his head again. Yes, your majesty. The king's golden eyes narrowed slightly, because the man standing before him was not behaving like the Lucian Ardent he knew. Lucian was supposed to be arrogant, provocative, sharp-tongued, yet this Omeaga seemed calm, thoughtful, almost cautious. Ryan leaned slightly closer, close enough to catch more of that subtle scent. Lucian remained perfectly still. Only his heartbeat betrayed him. Fast, controlled. Adrian's voice lowered slightly. You seem different today. A quiet murmur passed through the court. Lucian Ardent. Different? Lucian smiled faintly. Perhaps your majesty simply never looked closely before. Adrian studied him for another long moment. Then something unexpected happened. The king smiled, just slightly, a rare expression that almost no one in the empire ever saw. Perhaps. He turned and continued toward the throne, but his thoughts lingered, because instinct told him something important. Something had changed, and the center of that change was the Omeaga standing quietly behind him. Lucian Ardent. Across the hall, Lucian watched the king take his seat. Inside his chest, his heart was still beating faster than normal. He had just spoken to the man who once killed him, and Adrian had noticed the difference. Lucian looked down at his hands briefly. Good. That meant fate was already shifting. But he also knew something else. Something dangerous. Because Adrian Blackthorne was not just powerful. He was intelligent. And if the king became curious about Lucian, that curiosity could easily turn into something far more dangerous. Lucian glanced up once more. Their eyes met again, across the massive hall. Golden eyes, violet eyes, Alpha, Omeaga, Predator, Villain, and neither of them yet understood that this single moment had already begun rewriting the fate of the entire empire. Chapter 3. A Dangerous Curiosity. The royal court slowly returned to motion after the king took his seat. Nobles began speaking again. Servants moved silently along the edges of the hall, pouring wine and adjusting documents. But the atmosphere had changed, because everyone had noticed something unusual. The king had stopped for Lucian Ardent. That had never happened before, and the nobles of Veltharis were experts at noticing the smallest shifts in power. Whispers began immediately. Did you see that? The king spoke to him directly. Strange. I thought his majesty disliked the Ardent family. Lucian heard every whisper. His violet eyes remained calm, but internally, his mind was moving rapidly. In the original story, this moment never happened. Originally, Lucian had insulted a rival noble earlier that morning. The king had ignored him entirely. There had been no conversation, no attention, but now, the king had looked at him, studied him, and that was dangerous, because Adrian Blackthorne was not a man who looked at something without wanting to understand it completely. Lucian exhaled quietly. This may already be more dangerous than I expected. Across the hall, Adrian leaned slightly back against the imperial throne. His generals and ministers began presenting their reports. Trade routes, military funding, political disputes. Adrian listened. He always listened. But today a portion of his attention remained elsewhere, specifically on the silver-haired Omeaga standing among the nobles. Lucian Ardent. The duke stood with elegant stillness, hands loosely folded behind his back. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't stirring trouble. He was simply watching, observing the court quietly. That alone was strange. Adrian had dealt with Lucian Ardent for years. The man was notorious for ambition, always pushing for influence, always manipulating noble alliances. Yet today he seemed detached, almost thoughtful. Adrian's golden eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. The court meeting continued for nearly an hour. Finally, the imperial chancellor stepped forward. There is one final matter for discussion, your majesty. Adrian gestured slightly. Proceed. The Council of Nobles wishes to discuss the upcoming winter banquet. At this, the nobles stirred with interest. The winter banquet was the most important social gathering of the year. Every noble family attended. Political alliances were formed. Engagements were arranged. And occasionally, enemies destroyed each other with polite smiles. The Chancellor continued. Traditionally, the hosting responsibility rotates between the most powerful noble families. He paused. This year, the responsibility falls to House Ardent. All eyes turned toward Lucien. Lucien remained calm. Inside, his mind was racing, because this was another moment he remembered from the story. The winter banquet had been the beginning of Lucien's downfall. During that event, the original Lucien had attempted to manipulate several noble families into rebelling against the king. It had been the first step toward treason. Adrian's voice cut through the hall. Duke Ardent. Lucien stepped forward gracefully and bowed. Yes, your majesty. Will your family host the banquet as tradition requires? Lucien lifted his gaze slowly. His violet eyes met Adrian's golden ones. For a brief moment, the entire hall felt tense. Everyone expected arrogance, perhaps even manipulation. But Lucien spoke calmly. Of course, your majesty. His voice was soft, but steady. It would be my family's honor. A murmur moved through the nobles again. That response had been perfect. Too perfect. Adrian leaned slightly forward on his throne. His gaze sharpened. Yes, something had definitely changed. The court session finally ended. Nobles began leaving the hall in groups, discussing politics and alliances quietly. Lucien turned toward the exit, but before he could leave, a familiar voice spoke behind him. Lucien. Lucien paused. He already knew who it was. He turned slowly. Standing behind him was Leon Ardent, his younger brother. Leon looked exactly as Lucien remembered. Warm amber eyes, soft brown hair slightly messy from the wind. A kind face that people trusted instantly. Leon smiled when he saw him. You seem different today. Lucien blinked slightly. Even Leon had noticed. Lucien gave a faint smile. Different how? Leon tilted his head thoughtfully. Calmer. Lucien chuckled quietly. That sounds like an improvement. Laughed softly. Yes, actually, it does. For a moment, the tension between them faded. Lucien studied his brother carefully. In the original story, Leon eventually betrayed him. Not out of hatred, but out of desperation, because Lucien had pushed him away too many times. Lucien lowered his gaze briefly. This time, I won't repeat that mistake. He looked back up. Walk with me. Leon blinked in surprise. Of course. The two brothers left the palace together, but neither of them noticed something happening behind them. From the high palace balcony, Adrian Blackthorne was watching. His golden eyes followed the silver-haired Omeaga walking away. Lucien Ardent. The king rested one hand against the stone railing. His alpha instincts felt strangely alert. Curious, Lucien's scent still lingered faintly in his memory. Night jasmine, rain, something subtle, something tempting. Adrian rarely felt intrigued by anyone, but Lucien Ardent had just become interesting. Very interesting. The king spoke quietly to the air. Keep an eye on Duke Ardent. From the shadows behind him, a royal guard bowed. Yes, your majesty. Adrian's golden eyes remained fixed on the distant figure leaving the palace grounds. His voice lowered slightly. I want to know everything he does. And without realizing it, the most powerful alpha in the empire had just begun watching the man who once died by his sword. Meanwhile, outside the palace gates, Lucien paused briefly as a cold breeze moved through the streets. For a moment, he felt something strange, like someone watching him. He looked back toward the towering palace. His violet eyes narrowed slightly. The story is already changing. But Lucien did not yet realize how dangerous that change would become, because the king's curiosity was not something that faded easily. For an alpha like Adrian Blackthorne, curiosity could very quickly turn into possession. Chapter 4. Flashback. The first torture. Leon's past life. Pain was the first thing Leon remembered. Not a sharp pain. Not the quick sting of a wound. But the slow, crushing ache that came from being broken again and again until the body no longer knew how to heal. Darkness surrounded him. Cold stone pressed against his back. Chains wrapped tightly around his wrists. Leon's breathing was uneven as he slowly lifted his head. The dungeon smelled of rust and damp earth. A single torch flickered against the wall, casting weak orange light across the floor. And standing before him was Lucien Ardent. But this was not the Lucien from the present. This Lucien was colder, crueler, the villain of the original story. His silver hair fell perfectly down his back like flowing silk, untouched by the filth of the dungeon. His violet eyes held no warmth, only calculation, only quiet cruelty. He looked down at Leon like one might observe a broken object. "Still alive?" Lucien said softly. Leon tried to laugh. The sound came out as a weak cough. "You always underestimate me, brother." Lucien tilted his head slightly. For a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something almost human, but it disappeared quickly. "You betrayed me," Lucien said calmly. Leon shook his head weakly. "No, I tried to stop you." Lucien stepped closer. His boots echoed against the stone floor. "Stop me?" Leon lifted his gaze. Even beaten, even chained, there was stubborn fire in his amber eyes. "Yes." His voice was hoarse but determined. "You were going to destroy everything." Lucien's expression darkened slightly. "You chose the king over your own blood." Leon smiled faintly. "No," he coughed again, blood touching his lips. "I chose what was right." The silence between them grew heavy. Lucien stood motionless for several seconds. Then he sighed softly. So disappointing. He turned slightly toward the guards standing near the dungeon entrance. "Continue." The guards stepped forward immediately. They carried iron rods heated until they glowed faintly red. Leon's breathing slowed. He understood what was about to happen. But he did not beg. He had never begged. Even as the guards approached him, Leon only lifted his head one final time. His eyes met Lucien's, and in that moment, Lucien saw something he did not expect. Not hatred, not fear, but sadness. Leon whispered quietly. "You weren't always like this." Lucien froze. "Just for a second." Leon continued weakly. "You used to protect us." A faint memory flickered inside Lucien's mind. 3 children playing in the gardens of the Ardent estate. A young Lucien standing protectively in front of his siblings, promising to always take care of them. The memory vanished quickly. Lucien's face returned to its usual cold expression. That child no longer exists. He turned away. The guards raised the iron rods. The dungeon filled with the sound of burning flesh. Leon screamed. Hours later, the dungeon was silent again. Leon hung limply from the chains. Blood stained the stone floor beneath him, but he was still alive. Lucien returned once more. He stood in front of his brother quietly. Leon slowly lifted his head. His voice was barely audible. "Why?" Lucien stared at him. For a moment, the villain looked almost tired. "Because power demands sacrifice." Leon laughed weakly. "That's not power." He closed his eyes slowly. "That's loneliness." Lucien said nothing. He simply watched as the guards removed the chains. Leon collapsed onto the floor, unconscious, broken, and yet still alive. Years later, that same brother would stand beside the king during Lucien's execution. Not because he hated Lucien, but because Lucien had already destroyed the bond between them long ago. Present timeline. Leon Ardent suddenly woke up. His chest rose sharply as he gasped for air. Cold sweat covered his skin. The nightmare again. It had haunted him for years. He sat up slowly in the dim apartment bedroom. Beside him, a woman stirred slightly. She was beautiful. Long dark hair spread across the pillow, perfect skin, the face of someone famous, one of the Empire's most popular actresses, Alara Vale. Leon rubbed his face tiredly. His life now was nothing like the powerful, ardent family he once belonged to. He lived quietly, struggling, working small jobs, trying to survive while the world moved on without him. Ilara opened her eyes sleepily. "You had the nightmare again?" Leon nodded slowly. She sat up beside him, studying his face. "You always look like you're remembering something terrible." Leon stared at the floor. "Maybe I am." He didn't understand the dreams fully, but the pain felt real. The dungeon, the chains, Lucien's cold eyes. It all felt like memories rather than dreams. Ilara gently touched his arm. "You should talk to your brother." Leon laughed softly. "Lucien?" His voice carried quiet bitterness. He wouldn't care. Outside the apartment window, the city lights flickered in the distance. Somewhere far away, Lucien Ardent was already beginning to change fate itself. But Leon didn't know that yet, and neither of them realized that their past life pain was slowly pulling their futures together once again. Chapter 5. Leon's current life, struggles with the actress. Morning in the lower districts of Veltharis City was far different from the quiet luxury of noble estates. Instead of manicured gardens and marble fountains, the streets here were crowded and restless. Vendors shouted over each other in the markets. Steam rose from food stalls. Carriages rolled past buildings whose paint had long since faded from sun and rain. And in one narrow apartment building above a small cafe, Leon Ardent lived a life no one from the noble courts would ever imagine. Leon stood in the tiny kitchen, staring at the coffee brewing slowly in a battered metal pot. The apartment was small. One bedroom, one living area, bare wooden floors. The furniture looked second-hand but clean. The only luxury in the room was the large television mounted against the wall, because the woman sleeping in the bedroom was someone the entire Empire recognized. Ilara Vale, the Empire's most famous actress. Beautiful, elegant, adored by millions. But here, in this small apartment, she looked nothing like the woman on screen. Leon leaned against the counter, rubbing the back of his neck. His reflection in the window showed a tired man. His brown hair was slightly messy from sleep. His amber eyes carried faint dark circles. He wasn't weak. Years of manual work had given him a strong build. But there was something quietly worn about him, something heavy behind his eyes. The kind of exhaustion that didn't come from work. It came from memories, or perhaps from dreams that felt too real. Behind him, the bedroom door opened slowly. Ilara stepped out. Her long black hair fell loosely over her shoulders. Without makeup, she looked softer, more human, but her beauty was still undeniable. She stretched slightly, yawning. "You're up early again." Leon poured 2 cups of coffee. "I couldn't sleep." Ilara smiled faintly as she took the cup. "You never sleep." Leon didn't answer. He walked to the small table by the window and sat down. Outside, the city was already awake. Ilara watched him quietly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Their relationship had never been simple. They cared about each other, but the life they lived together felt unstable, as if both of them were drifting in directions they didn't fully understand. Ilara finally broke the silence. "My manager called." Leon raised an eyebrow slightly. "That early?" She shrugged. "I have a new role." Leon took a slow sip of coffee. "Congratulations." Ilara studied him carefully. "You didn't ask what the role is." Leon gave a faint smile. "It's probably another noble drama." Ilara hesitated. "Actually, it is." Leon chuckled quietly. "See?" But her expression didn't change. "It's about the Ardent family." Leon froze. The coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. What? Alara walked to the window beside him. The story follows a villainous noble named Lucian Ardent. Leon's heart beat slightly faster. That name again. Lucian, his brother. Alara continued slowly. The story ends with the king executing him for treason. Leon set the cup down carefully. His voice was quiet. That's dramatic. Alara nodded. It's supposed to be the biggest historical series this year. Leon leaned back in his chair. His mind felt strangely distant. Lucian Ardent. Even hearing the name made something inside him twist. Because despite their current distance, Lucian was still his brother. The one person who had once protected him. The one person who had eventually become someone Leon barely recognized. Alara watched his reaction carefully. You still think about him, don't you? Leon sighed. He's family. Alara crossed her arms. Family who barely acknowledges you anymore. Leon didn't respond. The truth hurt too much. Years ago, the Ardent siblings had been close. But Lucian's growing involvement in politics had changed everything. The man Leon once admired had become cold, strategic, distant. Arguments had grown worse over time. Until eventually, Leon simply left. Now he lived here, in a small apartment, dating an actress whose life was constantly surrounded by cameras and gossip. Alara sat across from him. You know what people say about your brother? Leon looked at her calmly. That he's dangerous, that he's ambitious, that he's planning something against the crown. Leon looked down at the table. Those rumors had always followed Lucian, but Leon had never fully believed them, because deep down, he remembered the brother who used to stand between him and danger when they were children. Alara reached across the table and touched his hand gently. You deserve better than living like this. Leon blinked. Like what? Hidden. She gestured around the apartment. You're the brother of one of the most powerful nobles in the empire. Leon laughed softly. Doesn't feel like it. Alara's eyes softened. Maybe you should go see him. Leon shook his head slowly. No. Why? Because I don't know who he is anymore. The room fell quiet again. Outside, the city continued moving, people rushing to work, carriages passing, life continuing as always. But somewhere across the city, Lucian Ardent was quietly changing the course of fate, and neither Leon nor Alara realized that the coming events would soon pull them directly into that storm. Leon stood up slowly. I need to go to work. Alara frowned slightly. You don't have to take those construction jobs anymore. Leon grabbed his jacket. Yes, I do. He turned toward the door. Before leaving, he paused briefly. Alara. She looked up. Yes? Leon gave a faint smile. Good luck with the show. She smiled back. Thanks. Leon left the apartment and stepped into the busy street below. The cold morning air brushed against his face, and once again that strange feeling returned, as if something in the world was shifting, changing. Leon looked toward the distant skyline of the noble district. Far beyond those towers, Lucian Ardent was standing at the center of a story that was beginning to unravel. And soon, Leon would be pulled back into it. Chapter 6. The Sister Who Loved Too Much. The Ardent estate stood quietly beneath the pale afternoon sun. Tall iron gates surrounded the massive property, their black metal twisted into elegant patterns of roses and thorns. The symbolism had always been fitting. House Ardent was beautiful, but it was also dangerous. Inside the estate gardens, servants moved carefully between marble statues and perfectly trimmed hedges. Every movement was quiet, every step controlled, because the master of the house disliked chaos. But there was someone else within the estate who frightened the servants even more. Lucian Ardent walked slowly along the stone path leading toward the training courtyard. The wind brushed gently through his silver hair as he moved. His mind remained busy. Every day in this new life required careful planning. Every decision mattered. The original Lucien had allowed emotions, pride, and anger to guide his actions. That had led directly to his death. This time, Lucien intended to become something far more dangerous. Patient, observant, strategic. But first, he needed to deal with someone who could easily destroy everything if left uncontrolled. His sister. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the courtyard. Clang, clang, clang. Lucien stepped through the open archway and stopped. Celine Ardent stood in the center of the training ground. Her long black hair had been tied behind her back in a loose braid. Sweat glistened lightly across her pale skin. In her hands was a thin dueling sword. A large alpha soldier, hired to train noble families. His face already showed exhaustion. Celine's crimson eyes burned with unnatural intensity. "Again," she said calmly. The instructor hesitated. "My lady, perhaps we should—" Celine lunged forward. Her sword moved like lightning. The instructor barely blocked in time. Their blades clashed again. Celine attacked relentlessly. Precise, fast, brutal. She was not simply training. She was hunting. Within seconds, the instructor's sword was knocked from his hand. Celine's blade stopped just inches from his throat. The courtyard fell silent. Celine's chest rose slowly as she breathed. Then she smiled. It was not a worn smile. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed control. "You're getting slower." The instructor swallowed nervously. "My lady, I assure you, that wasn't a compliment." Lucien watched quietly from the archway. Yes, this matched his memories perfectly. Celine had always been dangerous. Her love for Lucien was absolute. But that love had twisted over the years into something darker. Possessive. Obsessive. In the original story, Celine had eventually become one of Lucien's most loyal supporters during his attempted rebellion. She had killed multiple nobles without hesitation. Even now, Lucien could see the same potential in her eyes. She noticed him suddenly. Her crimson gaze shifted instantly. The cold intensity vanished. "Brother." Her entire expression softened. She lowered the sword immediately and walked toward him. Servants watching from the edges of the courtyard relaxed slightly. Celine Ardent was terrifying to most people. But in front of Lucien, she became almost gentle. "Why didn't you tell me you were watching?" she asked softly. Lucien smiled faintly. "I didn't want to interrupt." Celine tilted her head. "You never interrupt." Her eyes studied him carefully. Celine noticed everything. Every small change. Every subtle movement. And today, something felt different. "You've been acting strange lately," she said quietly. Lucien raised an eyebrow. "Strange?" Celine stepped closer. Her gaze sharpened slightly. "You're calmer." Lucien chuckled softly. "That seems to be everyone's observation today." Celine did not laugh. She leaned closer, studying his face. "You used to look angry." Her voice lowered. "Now you look thoughtful." Lucien met her gaze calmly. "That worries you?" Celine shook her head slowly. "No." Her lips curved slightly. "I like it." She stepped back and twirled the sword lightly in her hand. "But if anyone thinks you've become weak—" Her crimson eyes darkened slightly. "I'll kill them." The instructor standing nearby suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Lucien sighed quietly. Yes, this was exactly the problem. Celine's loyalty was absolute, but it was also dangerous. Devotion could destroy everything he was trying to rebuild. Lucien stepped into the courtyard. "Celine." She immediately straightened. "Yes? Walk with me." She handed the sword to the instructor without looking at him. "Of course." They moved slowly through the garden paths together. The wind moved gently through the tall trees surrounding the estate. Celine walked beside him silently for a while. Then she spoke. "You saw the king today." Lucien glanced at her. "You heard?" Celine smiled slightly. "The court is full of gossip." She looked forward again. "What did he say to you?" Lucien considered the question. "Not much." Celine's expression darkened slightly. "That man." Lucien stopped walking. Celine looked at him. Lucien spoke quietly. "Celine?" "Yes?" "Never speak about the king carelessly." Her crimson eyes narrowed. "Why?" Lucien looked toward the distant mountains. Because Adrian Blackthorne was far more dangerous than anyone realized. And if Celine ever provoked him, even Lucien might not be able to protect her. Lucien turned back to her. Because some enemies are too powerful to provoke. Celine studied him for several seconds. Then she smiled again. Soft, but unsettling. "Don't worry." Her voice was quiet. "I would never hurt the king." Lucien relaxed slightly, until she added, "Unless he hurts you first." Lucien sighed quietly. Yes, this was going to be difficult. High above the estate walls, a shadow moved quietly along the rooftops. A royal spy, watching, observing, and reporting everything back to one person. King Adrian Blackthorne. The Alpha King's curiosity had already begun spreading through the empire. And the center of that curiosity was Lucien Ardent. Chapter 7. The Sister Who Loved Too Much. The Ardent estate stood quietly beneath the pale afternoon sun. Tall iron gates surrounded the massive property, their black metal twisted into elegant patterns of roses and thorns. The symbolism had always been fitting. House Ardent was beautiful, but it was also dangerous. Inside the estate gardens, servants moved carefully between marble statues and perfectly trimmed hedges. Every movement was quiet, every step controlled, because the master of the house disliked chaos. But there was someone else within the estate who frightened the servants even more. Lucien Ardent walked slowly along the stone path leading toward the training courtyard. The wind brushed gently through his silver hair as he moved. His mind remained busy. Every day in this new life required careful planning. Every decision mattered. The original Lucien had allowed emotions, pride, and anger to guide his actions. That had led directly to his death. This time, Lucien intended to become something far more dangerous. Patient, observant, strategic. But first, he needed to deal with someone who could easily destroy everything if left uncontrolled. His sister. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the courtyard. Clang, clang, clang. Lucien stepped through the open archway and stopped. Celine Ardent stood in the center of the training ground. Her long black hair had been tied behind her back in a loose braid. Sweat glistened lightly across her pale skin. In her hands was a thin dueling sword. Across from her stood a royal instructor, a large alpha soldier hired to train noble families. His face already showed exhaustion. Celine's crimson eyes burned with unnatural intensity. "Again," she said calmly. The instructor hesitated. "My lady, perhaps we should—" Celine lunged forward. Her sword moved like lightning. The instructor barely blocked in time. Their blades clashed again. Celine attacked relentlessly. Precise, fast, brutal. She was not simply training. She was hunting. Within seconds, the instructor's sword was knocked from his hand. Celine's blade stopped just inches from his throat. The courtyard fell silent. Celine's chest rose slowly as she breathed. Then she smiled. It was not a worn smile. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed control. "You're getting slower." The instructor swallowed nervously. "My lady, I assure you." That wasn't a compliment. Lucien watched quietly from the archway. Yes, this matched his memories perfectly. Celine had always been dangerous. Her love for Lucien was absolute. But that love had twisted over the years into something darker, possessive, obsessive. In the original story, Celine had eventually become one of Lucien's most loyal supporters during his attempted rebellion. She had killed multiple nobles without hesitation. Even now, Lucien could see the same potential in her eyes. She noticed him suddenly. Her crimson gaze shifted instantly. The cold intensity vanished. "Brother." Her entire expression softened. She lowered the sword immediately and walked toward him. Servants watching from the edges of the courtyard relaxed slightly. Celine Ardent was terrifying to most people. But in front of Lucien, she became almost gentle. "Why didn't you tell me you were watching?" she asked softly. Lucien smiled faintly. "I didn't want to interrupt." Celine tilted her head. "You never interrupt." Her eyes studied him carefully. Celine noticed everything, every small change, every subtle movement. And today, something felt different. "You've been acting strange lately," she said quietly. Lucien raised an eyebrow. "Strange?" Celine stepped closer. Her gaze sharpened slightly. "You're calmer." Lucien chuckled softly. "That seems to be everyone's observation today." Celine did not laugh. She leaned closer, studying his face. "You used to look angry." Her voice lowered. "Now you look thoughtful." Lucien met her gaze calmly. "That worries you?" Celine shook her head slowly. "No." Her lips curved slightly. "I like it." She stepped back and twirled the sword lightly in her hand. "But if anyone thinks you've become weak," her crimson eyes darkened slightly, "I'll kill them." The instructor standing nearby suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Lucien sighed quietly. Yes, this was exactly the problem. Celine's loyalty was absolute, but it was also dangerous. Devotion could destroy everything he was trying to rebuild. Lucien stepped into the courtyard. "Celine." She immediately straightened. "Yes?" "Walk with me." She handed the sword to the instructor without looking at him. "Of course." They moved slowly through the garden paths together. The wind moved gently through the tall trees surrounding the estate. Celine walked beside him silently for a while. Then she spoke. "You saw the king today." Lucien glanced at her. "You heard?" Celine smiled slightly. "The court is full of gossip." She looked forward again. "What did he say to you?" Lucien considered the question. "Not much." Celine's expression darkened slightly. "That man." Lucien stopped walking. Celine looked at him. Lucien spoke quietly. "Celine." "Yes?" "Never speak about the king carelessly." Her crimson eyes narrowed. "Why?" Lucien looked toward the distant mountains. "Because Adrian Blackthorn was far more dangerous than anyone realized. And if Celine ever provoked him, even Lucien might not be able to protect her." Lucien turned back to her. "Because some enemies are too powerful to provoke." Celine studied him for several seconds. Then she smiled again. Soft, but unsettling. "Don't worry." Her voice was quiet. "I would never hurt the king." Lucien relaxed slightly. "Unless he hurts you first." Lucien sighed quietly. Yes, this was going to be difficult. High above the estate walls, a shadow moved quietly along the rooftops. A royal spy, watching, observing, and reporting everything back to one person, King Adrian Blackthorn. The Alpha King's curiosity had already begun spreading through the empire. And the center of that curiosity was Lucien Ardent. Chapter 8. The First Manipulation. Morning fog rolled slowly across the capital of Veltharis, wrapping the noble district in a quiet gray veil. From the balcony of the Ardent estate, Lucian watched the city wake. Carriages moved through the distant streets. Market stalls opened. Smoke curled from chimneys as the empire began another ordinary day. But for Lucian Ardent, nothing about this day was ordinary. Because today, he would begin the first true step in changing fate. Lucian rested one hand against the cold marble railing. In the original story, the Duke of Ardent had made a critical mistake early in his rise to power. He had acted too openly, too aggressively, trying to gather allies for rebellion too quickly. That mistake had placed him directly under the king's suspicion, and eventually, under the king's sword. Lucian exhaled quietly. This time, I'll move differently. No rebellion, no reckless ambition. Instead, control, influence, and subtle manipulation. Behind him, the balcony door opened softly. Celine stepped outside. Her long black hair flowed freely over her shoulders today, contrasting sharply with the white silk dress she wore. Her crimson eyes immediately softened when she saw him. "You woke early again." Lucian smiled faintly. "I had things to think about." Celine leaned beside him on the railing. "You've been thinking a lot lately." Lucian glanced at her. "That bothers you?" Celine shook her head slowly. "No." She tilted her head slightly. "But it means something is changing." Lucian didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the estate gardens below. "Celine." "Yes?" "Do you know who controls the grain trade in the western provinces?" Celine blinked. "That's specific." Lucian waited patiently. Celine thought for a moment. "House Valmir." Lucian nodded. "Correct. House Valmir controlled nearly half of the empire's grain distribution. Food meant power, and power meant influence." Celine studied him carefully. "Why are you asking about grain?" Lucian's violet eyes darkened slightly. "Because winter is coming." Celine smiled slowly. Oh. Now she understood. Food shortages during winter often forced nobles to negotiate trade deals quickly, and desperate nobles made easy allies. Celine's smile grew slightly more dangerous. "You're planning something." Lucian chuckled quietly. "Not something. Many things." Later that afternoon, a luxurious carriage stopped in front of the Valmir estate. The gates opened immediately. The servants bowed deeply. Lucian Ardent rarely visited other noble houses personally. When he did, it meant something important. Inside the estate's grand hall, Lord Marcus Valmir waited. Marcus Valmir was a tall beta noble, with sharp features and calculating gray eyes. He was not a warrior, but his influence over the empire's grain trade was a force to be reckoned with. Food trade made him incredibly powerful. Marcus bowed politely as Lucian entered. "Duke Ardent." Lucian returned the greeting smoothly. "Lord Valmir." They sat across from each other in a quiet meeting room. Servants poured tea, then left quickly. Marcus studied Lucian with curiosity. "I was surprised to receive your request for a meeting." Lucian smiled faintly. "I hope it wasn't inconvenient." Marcus shook his head. "Not at all." But his eyes narrowed slightly. Lucian Ardent never did anything without purpose. "So," Marcus said calmly, "what brings the Duke of Ardent to my estate?" Lucian lifted his teacup slowly. "Winter." Marcus blinked. "Winter?" Lucian nodded. "You control most of the western grain trade." Marcus leaned back slightly. "Yes, that's true." Lucian placed the cup down gently. "And the northern provinces suffered drought this year." Marcus's eyes sharpened immediately. That information was not public yet. "How do you know that?" Marcus asked. Lucian smiled. "I make it my business to know things." Marcus studied him carefully. Lucian continued calmly. "When winter arrives, the northern nobles will need grain." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes. And they'll be willing to pay extremely high prices." Marcus crossed his arms. "That's how trade works." Lucian leaned slightly forward. "But what if they didn't have to?" Marcus frowned. Remained calm. "What if House Valmir could supply them at reasonable prices?" Marcus laughed quietly. That would destroy my profit. Lucien smiled. Not if someone compensated you. The room grew quiet. Marcus's mind began racing. You? Lucien tilted his head slightly. My family has considerable financial reserves. Marcus studied him carefully. Why would you do that? Lucien's answer came smoothly. Because grateful nobles become loyal allies. Marcus stared at him. Now the real motive was clear. Political influence. Lucien was buying loyalty through generosity. It was brilliant. And dangerous. Marcus leaned forward slowly. You're planning something big. Lucien's smile remained calm. Only preparing for the future. Marcus watched him for several long seconds. Then finally nodded. I'm listening. Hours later, Lucien left the Valmir estate. His carriage rolled slowly back toward the Ardent district. Inside the carriage, Lucien closed his eyes briefly. The first move was complete. Soon several northern noble houses would become quietly loyal to him. Not through fear, not through threats, but through gratitude, a far stronger bond. But somewhere else in the city, someone had already heard about the meeting. Inside the imperial palace, Adrian Blackthorne stood beside the large map of the empire again. A royal spy spoke quietly. Your Majesty, Duke Ardent visited House Valmir today. Adrian's golden eyes lifted slightly. Did he? Yes. What did they discuss? The spy hesitated. Grain trade. Adrian smiled faintly. Interesting. Very interesting. Lucien Ardent was building influence quietly. Carefully. Not rebellion. Something smarter. Adrian's golden eyes darkened slightly. So, that's your game. He turned toward the palace window again, looking out toward the distant noble district, toward the estate where a silver-haired Omeaga was quietly reshaping the empire's future. Adrian spoke softly to himself. Lucien Ardent. His voice carried a hint of amusement, and something deeper, something possessive. You're becoming more interesting every day. And the Alpha King found himself wanting to see exactly how far this dangerous Omeaga would go. Back Sick Cup. The King's private invitation. The Arden estate was quiet that evening. A soft golden sunset painted the sky above the distant mountains, and warm light spilled across the long stone paths of the gardens. Servants moved quietly through the halls, preparing dinner. Everything seemed peaceful. But Lucien Ardent knew better than to trust peace. Peace was usually the calm before something dangerous. And tonight, he had the strange feeling that danger was already approaching. Lucien sat in his private study, a candle burning beside the open documents spread across his desk. Trade reports. Letters from northern nobles. Messages confirming that House Valmir had begun quietly adjusting grain prices exactly as Lucien requested. Everything was moving smoothly. Too smoothly. Lucien tapped the edge of the desk lightly with one finger. Whenever plans went perfectly, it usually meant someone else had noticed. A quiet knock came from the door. Enter. The door opened slowly. Celine stepped inside, her crimson eyes immediately locked onto him. Brother? Lucien looked up. Yes? Celine walked further into the room holding a sealed envelope between her fingers. There's a message for you. Lucien frowned slightly. At this hour? Celine nodded. A royal messenger delivered it personally. The air in the room instantly became heavier. Lucien extended his hand slowly. Celine gave him the letter. Even before opening it, Lucien already knew who it was from. The black wax seal on the envelope carried the strong crest of the crown. The royal sigil of Strong King Adrian Blackthorne. Lucien broke the seal carefully. He unfolded the letter. The handwriting was sharp and confident. The words were short, direct. Duke Ardent, I would like to speak with you privately. Attend the palace tomorrow evening. Adrian Blackthorne. Lucian stared at the letter for several seconds. Celine watched his expression carefully. Bad news? Celine asked. Lucian folded the paper slowly. Not yet, he replied. Celine crossed her arms. Why does the king want to meet you privately? She asked. Lucian stood from his chair and walked toward the window. Outside, darkness had begun covering the estate. Because he's curious, Lucian replied. Celine tilted her head slightly. About what? Lucian looked out toward the distant lights of the capital city. About me. Celine's eyes narrowed immediately. That's not good, she said. Lucian gave a faint smile. No, it isn't. Inside the imperial palace, Adrian Blackthorne stood in the private training hall. The large chamber echoed with the sound of steel striking steel. A royal guard attacked. Adrian blocked easily. The king's sword moved with precise control. Years of battle experience made his movements fluid and deadly. Within seconds, Adrian disarmed the guard. The man stepped back quickly, bowing. Your Majesty. Adrian lowered the sword slowly. Enough. The guard left immediately. Adrian walked toward a nearby table and poured himself a glass of water. His muscles were still warm from training, but his mind remained focused elsewhere. On a silver-haired Omeaga, Lucian Ardent. The Duke had begun making quiet moves within the empire. Trade agreements, political connections, nothing illegal, nothing openly rebellious, but far too intelligent to be coincidence. Adrian leaned against the table slightly. Lucian was playing a careful game, and Adrian wanted to know exactly what the rules were. More importantly, he wanted to see Lucian again, up close, without the eyes of the entire court watching them. The next evening arrived quickly. The palace corridors were dimly lit with tall golden lamps. Lucian walked through them calmly, escorted by a royal guard. His silver hair reflected the soft light with every step. His expression remained perfectly composed. But inside, his mind was alert. Meeting Adrian privately was dangerous. Because Adrian Blackthorne was not simply a king. He was an alpha at the very top of the hierarchy. Strong, dominant, possessive by nature. And Lucian was an Omeaga, which meant the natural instincts between them could become complicated. The guard stopped in front of a tall wooden door. His Majesty is waiting inside. Lucian nodded. The guard opened the door, then stepped aside. Lucian entered the room. The king's private study was much larger than Lucian expected. Tall bookshelves lined the walls. A massive window overlooked the capital city. And standing near that window was Adrian Blackthorne. The king turned slowly when Lucian entered. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Lucian bowed respectfully. Your Majesty. Adrian studied him silently. Up close, Lucian's beauty was even more striking. Silver hair, pale skin, violet eyes that seemed almost unnatural in the candlelight. And that scent again. Night jasmine. Soft, subtle, yet strangely intoxicating. Adrian walked closer. Lucian remained perfectly still. The distance between them closed slowly. Too close. Far closer than normal royal etiquette allowed. Lucian could feel the warmth of Adrian's presence, feel the powerful alpha pheromones filling the air. Cold winter forests, iron, storm wind. Lucian's heartbeat quickened slightly. Adrian noticed immediately. A faint smile touched the king's lips. You seem nervous. Lucian lifted his gaze calmly. I'm standing alone with the most powerful man in the empire. Adrian chuckled softly. He stepped even closer. Now only a few inches separated them. Lucian forced himself to remain calm. Adrian lowered his voice slightly. You've been very busy lately. Lucian blinked once. Busy? Adrian mentioned the Valmir meeting. Lucian's mind sharpened instantly. So the king already knew. Of course he did. Adrian watched his reaction carefully. "You're building alliances." Lucian gave a faint smile. "I'm preparing for winter." Adrian's golden eyes darkened slightly. "That's not the only thing you're preparing for." Lucian met his gaze. The tension between them thickened. Alpha, Omega, predator, villain. Adrian studied him for several long seconds. Then he spoke quietly. "You've changed, Lucian." Lucian tilted his head slightly. "Is that a problem?" Adrian's smile returned. "Slow. Dangerous. No." His voice dropped lower. "It's very interesting." For the first time, Lucian truly understood something dangerous. Adrian Blackthorne was not suspicious. He was fascinated. And fascination from a powerful alpha could easily turn into obsession. Adrian stepped back slightly, breaking the intense closeness between them. "For now," the king said calmly, "I'll simply watch." Lucian frowned slightly. "Watch?" Adrian's golden eyes held quiet amusement. "Yes." He turned back toward the window, overlooking the city. "I want to see what you do next." Lucian stood silently for a moment. Then he bowed again. "As you wish, Your Majesty." But as Lucian turned to leave the room, he felt Adrian's gaze still resting on him. Heavy, intense, possessive. And Lucian realized something deeply troubling. The king was no longer simply curious. Something had already begun growing inside Adrian Blackthorne. Something powerful, something dangerous, and something that would eventually change both of their fates forever. Chapter 10. The Alpha's Instinct. The palace corridors were silent as Lucian left the king's private study. His footsteps echoed softly across the polished marble floors. A royal guard walked several steps behind him, escorting him toward the exit. Lucian's expression remained perfectly calm. But inside, his mind was moving quickly, too quickly. The meeting with Adrian Blackthorne had gone differently than expected. Lucian had prepared for suspicion, for threats, for interrogation. Instead, the king had simply watched him, studied him, observed him like a hunter observing unfamiliar prey. Lucian exhaled quietly. That might actually be worse. Behind the large doors of the private study, Adrian Blackthorne remained standing beside the window. The city of Veltharis stretched endlessly below him, lights glowing in the night like scattered stars. But Adrian wasn't looking at the city. His mind was still replaying the last few minutes, Lucian's calm voice, the way the silver strands of his hair caught the candlelight, the subtle scent that lingered in the air long after he had left. Adrian slowly closed his eyes. That scent again, night jasmine, cool rain, something delicate but strangely sharp beneath it. His alpha instinct stirred again, stronger this time, more aware. Adrian rarely reacted so strongly to pheromones. Most Omegas tried too hard to attract attention. Their scents were heavy, sweet, obvious. Lucian's scent was different, subtle, controlled, almost restrained. Adrian opened his eyes slowly. His golden gaze darkened slightly. This was becoming interesting in a way he hadn't expected. Lucian Ardent had always been known as a political threat, an ambitious noble, a potential rebel. But now, Adrian was seeing something else, something far more intriguing. Someone intelligent, patient, careful. A man deliberately reshaping the political landscape of the empire, and doing it quietly. That kind of mind fascinated Adrian. But it wasn't just the strategy. It was also the way Lucian stood in front of him, calm, unafraid, even when surrounded by the overwhelming presence of a dominant alpha. Most Omegas instinctively lowered their gaze around someone like Adrian. Lucian had not. That alone was unusual. Adrian's lips curved slightly. Very unusual. Meanwhile, outside the palace gates, Lucian stepped into the waiting Ardent carriage. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The carriage began moving immediately. Lucien leaned back against the seat. Only then did he allow his shoulders to relax slightly. The king was dangerous. Lucien had known that from the beginning. But now he understood something even more troubling. Adrian Blackthorne wasn't simply watching him. He was interested in him. And interest from a dominant alpha like Adrian could quickly become something far more dangerous. Lucien rubbed his temples lightly. I need to be careful. One wrong move could place him directly under the king's control. And once Adrian Blackthorne decided something belonged to him, he rarely let it go. The next morning at the Ardent estate, the training courtyard echoed once again with the sound of steel. Celine's sword cut through the air in precise, fast movements. The instructor across from her struggled to keep up. Celine attacked relentlessly. Her crimson eyes burned with focus. Then suddenly, Lucien stepped into the courtyard. Celine immediately stopped. Her sword lowered instantly. Brother. Lucien walked toward her slowly. You're training harder than usual. Celine wiped a small drop of sweat from her cheek. I heard about your meeting with the king. Lucien raised an eyebrow. The entire estate knows already? Celine smiled faintly. Of course. She stepped closer. What did he want? Lucien considered the question, then answered simply. He's curious. Celine's expression darkened immediately. That's bad. Lucien chuckled softly. You noticed too. Celine crossed her arms. Curiosity from powerful men always turns into trouble. Lucien looked toward the distant horizon. Yes. Celine studied him carefully. Are you afraid of him? Lucien thought about that for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly. No. Celine raised an eyebrow. Then what? Lucien's violet eyes grew slightly colder. I'm cautious. Celine smiled again. Sharp. Dangerous. That's good. She lifted her sword again. If he tries to hurt you. Her crimson eyes flashed. I'll kill him. Lucien sighed quietly. No, you won't. Celine pouted slightly. You always ruin my fun. Far away inside the palace, Adrian Blackthorne sat in the war chamber again. But today, the war maps were no longer the focus of his attention. Instead, a single report lay open on the table. Lucien Ardent. Every movement the Duke made was now being recorded. Adrian studied the report quietly. Then he smiled faintly. So you're being cautious. He closed the file slowly. That's fine. Adrian stood from the table, because cautious prey often made the most interesting hunt. But this wasn't simply a hunt anymore. Something deeper had begun stirring in Adrian's instincts. Something primal. Something possessive. Lucien Ardent had caught the attention of the Alpha King. And attention from a man like Adrian Blackthorne was something that could easily turn into obsession. H1, Chapter 11, The Winter Banquet Preparations. H1. Winter arrived slowly over the empire of Grand Theris. Cold winds moved down from the northern mountains, brushing across the capital city and covering the distant forests with a thin veil of frost. For most people, winter meant quiet nights and warm hearths. For the noble families of the empire, winter meant politics. And nothing symbolized noble politics more than the strong winter banquet. This year, the responsibility of hosting the grand event belonged to strong House Ardent, which meant every powerful noble in the empire would soon gather inside Lucien's estate. And that meant danger. The Ardent estate had transformed overnight. Servants rushed through the halls preparing decorations. Golden chandeliers were polished until they shined like stars. Long tables were placed inside the grand ballroom, each covered in deep crimson cloth, embroidered with silver thread. Outside in the gardens, hundreds of lanterns were being hung among the trees. The entire estate would glow like a small city when the banquet began. Lucien stood in the center of the ballroom, quietly observing the preparations. His silver hair reflected the warm light from the chandeliers above. Celine walked beside him, arms folded as she studied the room. "You're planning something," she said calmly. Lucien didn't look at her. "Of course." Celine smiled slightly. "That's what I thought." She walked slowly between the long tables. "You've invited more nobles than usual." Lucien nodded. "Yes." Celine turned back toward him. "Why?" Lucien's violet eyes moved across the ballroom. Every table, every entrance, every window. He was studying the room like a battlefield. Because in many ways, that's exactly what it was. "The winter banquet is the center of noble society," Lucien said quietly. "Every alliance begins here, and every betrayal." Celine leaned against one of the tables. "And every betrayal." Lucien gave a faint smile. "Yes." Celine watched him carefully. "You're building something." Lucien met her crimson gaze. "I'm building protection." Celine tilted her head. "Protection from the king?" Lucien paused for a moment, then answered honestly. "From fate." Celine didn't understand that answer, but she trusted him enough not to question further. Across the city, inside the imperial palace, Adrian Blackthorne was already preparing for the banquet as well. The king rarely attended noble gatherings. His presence alone was enough to make the entire court nervous. But this year was different, because this year the banquet belonged to Lucien Ardent. Adrian stood in front of a large mirror, while a royal servant adjusted the dark coat of his formal attire. Black fabric, golden embroidery, the imperial crest across his chest. The servant stepped back nervously. "You look perfect, Your Majesty." Adrian glanced at his reflection briefly. Tall, broad shoulders, black hair falling slightly over his forehead. Golden eyes watching the world with quiet authority. But even as the servant finished preparing him, Adrian's mind remained somewhere else. Specifically, at the Ardent estate, where Lucien Ardent was waiting. Adrian dismissed the servant with a simple gesture. When the room was empty again, he spoke quietly to himself. "Let's see what you're planning." Because Adrian was certain of one thing. Lucien Ardent did not host events without purpose, and Adrian intended to discover exactly what that purpose was. Night fell across the capital. Snow began drifting slowly through the cold air. Carriages lined the long road leading to the Ardent estate. Noble families arrived, one after another. Elegant dresses, expensive suits, jewels glittering beneath the lantern light. Servants guided guests toward the grand ballroom. Inside, music already filled the air. Lucien stood near the entrance of the hall, greeting each noble with polite elegance. His silver hair flowed smoothly down his back. His dark formal coat fit him perfectly, emphasizing his tall, slender frame. He looked every bit the powerful Duke of Ardent. Celine stood beside him like a silent shadow. Her crimson eyes watched every guest carefully, evaluating, judging, protecting. One noble couple approached. Lucien greeted them smoothly. Another followed, and another. The ballroom slowly filled with voices and music. Then suddenly, the music stopped. The entire room fell silent, because someone new had arrived. The massive doors of the ballroom opened slowly. The royal guards stepped inside first. Then the announcer's voice echoed across the hall. "His Imperial Majesty, King Adrian Blackthorne." Every noble in the room bowed immediately. Adrian stepped inside. Tall, powerful. The golden embroidery of his coat shimmered beneath the lantern light. His presence alone changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Silence followed him as he walked forward. Then his golden eyes found Lucien, and a faint smile appeared. Lucien lifted his gaze slowly. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The nobles, the music, the conversation. Only the two of them existed in that moment. Predator, Omeaga, king, villain. Adrian walked closer. Lucien bowed politely. "Your Majesty." Adrian stopped in front of him. "You've prepared quite the event." Lucien smiled faintly. "I'm glad your Majesty could attend." Adrian studied him carefully. Lucien's scent drifted through the air again. Night jasmine. Soft. Tempting. Adrian leaned slightly closer. "Tonight will be interesting." Lucien's violet eyes flickered with quiet amusement. Yes, he knew that already. Because tonight was not simply a banquet. It was the moment Lucien intended to reshape the balance of power in the Empire. And Adrian Blackthorne was standing right in the center of it, watching him, waiting, and perhaps already beginning to want something far more dangerous than political control. Chapter 12. The Banquet Where Everything Changes. The winter banquet had fully awakened. Music flowed through the grand ballroom of the Ardent estate like a soft river of sound. Violins played elegant melodies, while nobles laughed, spoke, and whispered among themselves. Crystal chandeliers glowed above like captured stars. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted gently through the cold night. Inside, politics had already begun. Lucien stood near the center of the room, holding a delicate glass of wine. His posture was relaxed, yet his violet eyes moved constantly, observing every small detail around him. Every conversation, every glance, every alliance forming between nobles. To most people, the banquet looked like a celebration. But to Lucien, it was a battlefield. And tonight, he intended to win. Across the room, King Adrian Blackthorne watched him. The king stood near one of the tall marble pillars, his presence surrounded by royal guards and nervous nobles hoping to gain favor. But Adrian wasn't listening to them. His golden eyes remained fixed on Lucien, watching, studying. Lucien moved through the ballroom gracefully, speaking with one noble family, then another. Each conversation was brief, carefully controlled, strategic. Adrian could see it clearly. Lucien was planting seeds, small political promises, subtle alliances, carefully chosen partnerships. It was impressive. Most nobles manipulated loudly, greedily. Lucien did it quietly, like a chess master moving pieces across a board no one else could see. Adrian's lips curved slightly. "You really are interesting." Near the edge of the ballroom, Celine stood beside a window. Her crimson eyes followed Lucien's movements across the hall. She understood exactly what her brother was doing. Lucien had always been like this, patient, quiet, dangerous. He had spent months preparing for this night. And now the Empire's most powerful families were slowly stepping into the web he had built. Celine smiled faintly. "Anyone who underestimates my brother is already doomed." Lucien approached a group of influential nobles gathered near the wine tables. Lord Valtieri, Duke Seraph, Lady Ravenna, all powerful figures within the Empire's noble council. Lucien greeted them politely. The conversation began casually. Weather, trade, military updates from the northern border. But beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. Lucien mentioned a potential shipping route through Ardent territory. Lord Valtieri immediately showed interest. Then, Lucien mentioned a mining project in the southern mountains. Duke Seraph leaned closer. Each topic was carefully chosen. Each promise subtly tied those nobles closer to House Ardent. Adrian watched everything, and he understood exactly what Lucien was doing. The young duke wasn't simply building alliances. He was quietly creating a network of loyalty, a power structure strong enough to challenge even the throne. Adrian should have been concerned. Instead, He felt fascinated and strangely amused. The surrounding nobles immediately stepped back, giving them space. Lucien bowed slightly. "Your Majesty." Adrian glanced toward the dance floor. "Would you honor me with a dance?" The entire room fell silent again. An Alpha King asking an Omega noble to dance in public. It was not a simple request. It was a statement, a claim of attention. Every noble present understood that. Lucien understood it too. But refusing the king would create even more suspicion. So Lucien simply smiled. "Of course, Your Majesty." They stepped onto the dance floor. The music softened. Adrian placed one hand lightly on Lucien's waist. Lucien rested his hand on Adrian's shoulder. The contact sent a subtle spark through the air between them. The dance began. Slow, elegant, controlled. Lucien moved gracefully, perfectly matching Adrian's steps. The king leaned slightly closer. His voice dropped to a quiet whisper. "You're very skilled at politics." Lucien answered calmly, "And Your Majesty is very skilled at observation." Adrian smiled faintly. "You're building alliances tonight." Lucien didn't deny it. "Yes." Adrian's golden eyes studied him more closely. "You're ambitious." Lucien's expression didn't change. "I'm careful." Adrian leaned closer, close enough that Lucien could feel the warmth of his breath. "And if your ambition threatens the throne?" Lucien met his gaze directly. His violet eyes held no fear. "Then Your Majesty will stop me." For a moment, the music, the dancers, the entire ballroom faded away. Only the two of them existed inside that quiet tension. Adrian's alpha instincts stirred again, stronger than before. Lucien's scent filled the air around them, soft, tempting, dangerously addictive. Adrian's grip on Lucien's waist tightened slightly, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to make the message clear. Lucien noticed immediately, and yet he didn't pull away. Instead, he simply whispered back, "You're holding too tightly, Your Majesty." Adrian's lips curved slowly. "You're standing too close, Duke Ardent." Lucien gave a soft laugh, but inside, his heart was beating faster, because he could feel it now. The king's interest, the king's instincts, and something far more dangerous growing beneath them both. Obsession. Across the ballroom, Celine watched the dance. Her crimson eyes narrowed slightly. The king was holding Lucien too closely, too possessively. Celine's fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass. If Adrian Blackthorne ever tried to control her brother, Celine would burn the entire empire to protect him, even if it meant destroying the throne itself. Back on the dance floor, the music slowly came to an end. Adrian released Lucien's waist, but his golden eyes remained fixed on him. This banquet was well planned. Lucien bowed slightly. "I'm glad Your Majesty enjoyed it." Adrian leaned slightly closer one final time. His voice dropped to a low murmur only Lucien could hear. "But be careful, Duke Ardent." Lucien raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" Adrian's smile turned darker. "Of attracting the attention of an Alpha King." Then he stepped away, leaving Lucien standing alone in the center of the ballroom, and leaving behind a tension that would soon change the course of both their lives. Chapter 13. The Alpha Claim. The final notes of the dance slowly faded from the ballroom. Yet the tension between Lucien Ardent and Adrian Blackthorne lingered in the air long after their hands separated. Lucien returned to the edge of the ballroom, accepting another glass of wine from a passing servant. His expression remained composed, almost serene. But inside, his thoughts were sharper than ever. That was dangerous. Dancing with the king in front of the entire noble court was more than just social etiquette. It was a message. Every noble in the room had seen it. The king's attention had landed on Lucien Ardent. And in noble society, the attention of an alpha king was never something simple. Lucien lifted the wine glass to his lips, but didn't drink. His mind was already calculating the consequences. More eyes would be watching him now. More suspicion, more jealousy. But perhaps, more opportunities as well. Across the ballroom, Adrian stood beside the tall windows. The cold winter moonlight spilled through the glass, casting silver shadows across the polished marble floor. His golden eyes were still following Lucien. Even as nobles approached him with polite bows and cautious greetings, Adrian barely acknowledged them. His attention remained locked on the silver-haired Omeaga, moving calmly through the crowd. Something inside Adrian had shifted during that dance. It had begun as curiosity, a simple interest in a clever noble. But now, his instincts had begun to awaken, and an awakened alpha instinct could be very difficult to control. Adrian inhaled slowly. Lucien's scent still lingered faintly in the air. Night jasmine, cool rain, soft, subtle, yet strangely intoxicating. Most Omegas release their pheromones openly, hoping to attract powerful alphas. Lucien did the opposite. He controlled his scent carefully, restrained it, which only made Adrian want to chase it more. A slow smile appeared on Adrian's lips. Interesting. Near the ballroom entrance, Celine approached Lucien quietly. Her crimson eyes flicked briefly toward the king before returning to her brother. "You shouldn't have danced with him." Lucien smiled faintly. "I didn't have a choice." Celine crossed her arms. "You always have a choice." Lucien shook his head. "Not when the king asks." Celine leaned closer. "He was staring at you the entire time." Lucien sighed softly. "Yes, I noticed." Celine's voice dropped slightly. "That's not good." Lucien didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward Adrian across the room. Their eyes met again. For a moment, neither of them looked away. Then Lucien spoke quietly. "Maybe it is." Celine frowned. "You're planning something again." Lucien only smiled. Hours later, the banquet finally began to wind down. Guests slowly started leaving the estate. Carriages lined the snowy road once more. Inside the now quieter ballroom, servants began clearing tables and extinguishing lanterns. Lucien stepped outside onto the large balcony, overlooking the garden. Cold winter air brushed against his face. The snow had begun falling more heavily now, covering the ground in soft white layers. For the first time all night, Lucien allowed himself a moment of quiet. But the quiet didn't last long. Footsteps approached behind him, heavy, confident. Lucien didn't turn around. "Your Majesty would follow me." Adrian stepped beside him, resting one arm against the balcony railing. "You expected me?" Lucien glanced at him. "Of course." Adrian chuckled softly. "You're very confident." Lucien turned his gaze back toward the snowy garden. "I'm realistic." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Snow drifted slowly through the night air. Then Adrian moved slightly closer. Close enough that Lucien could feel the heat of his presence. "Tell me something, Duke Ardent." Lucien raised an eyebrow. "Yes?" Adrian's golden eyes studied him carefully. "Are you aware of what you're doing to my instincts?" Lucien's expression remained calm. "I'm not doing anything." Adrian leaned closer. "Your scent says otherwise." Lucien froze slightly. Adrian's voice dropped lower. "You're an Omeaga." Lucien didn't answer. Adrian's gaze darkened. "And you're standing alone with an Alpha King." Lucien slowly turned to face him. Their eyes met again. This time, they were much closer, much more dangerous. Lucien's voice remained calm. "Are you threatening me, Your Majesty?" Adrian smiled slowly. "No." His hand suddenly moved to Lucien's wrist. Not rough, but firm, possessive. "I'm warning you." Lucien's heart skipped slightly. The alpha pheromones surrounding Adrian had grown stronger, warmer, more dominant. Yen could feel them pressing against his senses. Most Omegas would instinctively submit under such pressure. Lucien didn't. Instead, he stepped even closer. Close enough that Adrian could clearly smell his scent. Night jasmine. Rain. Soft and tempting. Lucien spoke quietly. "If you're warning me," his violet eyes held Adrian's gaze steadily, "then why haven't you let go?" For a moment, the air between them grew dangerously thick. Adrian's grip tightened slightly. His instincts roared inside his chest. This Omega was provoking him, testing him, and Adrian had never been very patient with temptation. Slowly, his thumb brushed against Lucien's wrist, a subtle, claiming gesture. His voice dropped to a deep murmur. "You're playing with something dangerous, Lucien." Lucien didn't pull away. Instead, he whispered softly, "I know." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Then finally, Adrian released his wrist. But before stepping away, he leaned closer to Lucien's ear. His voice was barely a whisper. "And when my instincts decide they want something," his golden eyes gleamed, "they rarely give it back." Then he turned and walked away into the snowy night, leaving Lucien standing alone on the balcony, heart beating slightly faster than before. Because for the first time since his reincarnation, Lucien realized something. Adrian Blackthorne might become the most dangerous variable in his entire plan, and perhaps the most irresistible one as well. Chapter 14. Rumors spread through the empire. The morning after the winter banquet, the capital city of Valtharis woke beneath a sky of pale silver clouds. Snow still covered the rooftops, quiet and soft. But inside the noble districts, the calm winter morning was already filled with whispers. Because the nobles of the empire had witnessed something unusual the night before. The Alpha King had danced with an Omega Duke, and in the world of aristocratic politics, such a moment was never meaningless. Inside the estate of House Seraph, Lady Ravina sat near a fireplace while sipping warm tea. Across from her, two noblewomen leaned closer, their voices hushed but eager. "I saw it clearly," one whispered. "The king was watching him the entire night." Lady Ravina smiled faintly. "Of course he was." The other woman tilted her head. "But Duke Ardent is an Omega." Lady Ravina's eyes glimmered with quiet amusement. "Yes." She stirred her tea slowly. "And that makes it far more interesting." Similar conversations were happening across the capital, in noble mansions, inside council chambers, even among the royal advisors in the palace. Everywhere, the same question was being asked. Why was the king interested in Lucien Ardent? Was it political, strategic, or something far more personal? Rumors grew quickly. Some claimed the king planned to make Lucien a political ally. Others whispered that the king wanted to bind House Ardent closer to the throne. But a few rumors were darker, more dangerous. Some believed the king had chosen Lucien as his Omega. Inside the Ardent estate, Lucien sat quietly in his study. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows. Stacks of documents covered the large desk in front of him. Trade agreements, territory reports, political correspondences, but Lucien wasn't reading them. Instead, he stared thoughtfully at a single letter placed near the edge of the desk. It bore the imperial seal. Celine entered the room without knocking. Her crimson eyes immediately noticed the letter. "The palace?" Lucien nodded slowly. "Yes." Celine leaned against the doorframe. "What does the king want now?" Lucien opened the letter calmly. The message was short, elegant, direct. "Duke Ardent, your presence is requested at the Imperial Palace tomorrow afternoon." "That's Adrian Blackthorne." Celine raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a command." Lucien smiled faintly. "It is." Celine crossed her arms. "And you're going?" Lucien folded the letter carefully. "Yes." Celine studied his expression. "You're not worried?" Lucien leaned back in his chair. His silver hair shimmered softly in the sunlight. "Not particularly." Celine tilted her head. "You trust him?" Lucien laughed quietly. "Absolutely not." Celine smiled at that answer. Later that afternoon, Lucien walked through the estate gardens alone. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots. The winter air was sharp and clean. Lucien inhaled slowly, letting the cold calm his thoughts. The rumors spreading through the capital were exactly what he expected. The banquet had achieved its purpose. Noble alliances were shifting. Political attention had moved toward House Ardent. But the king's growing interest, that part of the plan had not been intentional. Lucien stopped beside a frozen fountain. His reflection stared back at him through the thin layer of ice. "An alpha king," he murmured quietly. In his previous life, Lucien had learned one painful truth. Powerful men rarely loved gently. They possessed, controlled, claimed. And Adrian Blackthorne felt like exactly that kind of man. Which meant Lucien needed to be careful. Very careful. Because the king was beginning to see him not just as a political player, but as something else entirely. Across the city, inside the imperial palace, Adrian Blackthorne stood in the royal training courtyard. His sword clashed sharply against the blade of his sparring partner. Steel rang through the cold air. Adrian moved with powerful precision, every strike strong, controlled, dominant. Finally, the sparring match ended. The opponent stepped back, breathing heavily. Adrian lowered his sword calmly, but his mind wasn't focused on training. It kept drifting back to the previous night. Lucien standing beneath the chandeliers. Lucien's calm smile. Lucien's scent drifting through the ballroom. Adrian wiped sweat from his neck with a cloth. Were becoming restless. And alpha instincts rarely lied. Something inside him had recognized Lucien. Not just as a clever political mind, but as something more primal. Something meant to stand beside him. Adrian exhaled slowly. Then he gave an order to the nearby servant. "Prepare the royal study tomorrow afternoon." The servant bowed. "Yes, Your Majesty." Adrian turned toward the palace gardens. Snow was falling again. Soft, quiet. But beneath that calm winter sky, something powerful had already begun forming. A connection between an alpha king and a villain Omeaga. A connection that could either strengthen the empire or burn it to the ground. Meanwhile, far away in another part of the city, Leon sat inside a luxurious apartment. Beside him on the couch was the famous actress Alara Vale. Her beauty had made her the darling of the entertainment world. Golden hair, elegant features, a smile that charmed every audience. But the atmosphere inside the room was tense. Alara scrolled through their phone with a frown. "Your brother is trending again." Leon leaned back against the couch, exhausted. "What did he do now?" She turned the screen toward him. Headlines filled the page. "Duke Ardent captures the king's attention. The Omeaga who danced with the Alpha King. Is a royal bond forming?" Leon's expression darkened. "Of course." Alara studied him. "You really hate him?" Leon didn't answer immediately. His dark eyes moved slowly toward the window. Snow fell quietly outside, and deep inside his chest, something painful stirred again. Memories, hatred, jealousy, and a past life that had ended in betrayal. The game between the brothers was not over yet, not even close, because while Lucien and Adrian were beginning their dangerous connection, Leon was still waiting in the shadows, and his story was far from finished. Chapter 15. The night Lucien's heat begins. The night air over Veltharis was colder than usual. Snow drifted slowly through the dark sky, settling across the rooftops of the sleeping capital. Inside the Ardent estate, most of the servants had already retired for the night. The halls were quiet, peaceful. But deep within the estate, in the private wing reserved for the Duke, Lucien Ardent sat alone in his study. And something felt wrong. A small fire burned in the marble fireplace, casting warm light across the room. Lucien leaned back in his chair, one hand pressed lightly against his temple. His breathing was slow, controlled, but his body felt strangely warm. Too warm. At first, he had assumed it was exhaustion. The winter banquet had demanded hours of careful conversation and political maneuvering. Then the palace summons, then the endless letters arriving throughout the day. Anyone would feel tired after that. But this was different. Lucien exhaled slowly. The warmth inside his body was spreading. It wasn't painful. It wasn't even unpleasant. But it was unfamiliar. And Lucien hated unfamiliar sensations. His violet eyes narrowed slightly. No. The realization came slowly, then all at once. Across the room, the clock chimed softly. Midnight. Lucien stood up. The moment he moved, a faint scent drifted through the air. Soft, sweet, like night jasmine blooming in warm rain. Lucien froze. Recognized that scent immediately. His own pheromones, and they were growing stronger. Lucien's hand tightened slightly against the desk. This is early. Omega heats usually followed predictable cycles. Lucien had calculated his carefully. He had prepared suppressants, control methods, precautions, everything necessary to maintain his independence. But his body had decided to betray him tonight. Perhaps it was the stress, perhaps the proximity to a powerful alpha, perhaps something deeper within his instincts had been stirred. Whatever the reason, his heat had begun. The warmth in his body deepened. A subtle ache settled low in his stomach. His skin felt more sensitive. The scent of jasmine filled the room more strongly now. Lucien inhaled sharply. He needed to control this, immediately. If the servants noticed, if Celine noticed, if anyone outside the estate smelled his pheromones, it could create problems he wasn't prepared to handle. Lucien moved toward the cabinet beside the bookshelf. Inside were small glass bottles, suppressants. He opened one quickly, but before he could drink it, the door behind him opened suddenly. Celine stepped inside the study. Lucien turned sharply. Celine, but his voice stopped, because the moment Celine entered the room, her expression changed. Her crimson eyes widened slightly. Brother. The scent of jasmine was now impossible to ignore. Celine closed the door quickly behind her. You're in heat. Yes. Celine walked closer, her expression serious now. You should have told me earlier. Lucien shook his head. It started suddenly. Celine glanced at the suppressant bottle in his hand. You were going to handle it alone? Lucien smiled faintly. I prefer solving my own problems. Celine rolled her eyes. Your stubbornness is exhausting. But despite her tone, she moved quickly to help. She opened the window slightly, allowing cold winter air to enter the room. Then she poured a glass of water and handed it to Lucien. Take the suppressant. Lucien drank it immediately. The liquid tasted bitter. Within moments, the burning warmth inside his body eased slightly. But it didn't disappear completely. Celine studied him carefully. It won't stop the heat entirely. Lucien nodded. I know. Suppressants only dulled the symptoms. They couldn't erase the instincts completely. Celine leaned against the desk. Her voice lowered slightly. Did something trigger it? Lucien hesitated. For the first time that night, a certain memory crossed his mind. Golden eyes, a powerful scent of alpha pheromones, a hand gripping his wrist on the balcony. Lucien exhaled slowly. Maybe. Celine noticed the shift in his expression. The king. Lucien didn't answer, which was answer enough. Celine groaned quietly. That man is trouble. Lucien laughed softly. Meanwhile, across the city. Inside the imperial palace, Adrian Blackthorne suddenly stopped walking. He had been moving through the palace gardens after finishing his evening meeting with the royal council. But something in the air made him pause. His golden eyes narrowed slightly. A faint scent drifted through the cold wind, soft, familiar, night jasmine. Adrian inhaled slowly. His instincts immediately recognized it. Lucien. The scent was weak due to distance, but it was unmistakable. And something about it had changed. It was warmer, richer, more vulnerable. Adrian's chest tightened slightly. Then the realization hit him. Heat. Lucien Arden's heat had begun. Adrian's alpha instincts reacted instantly. Possessive, protective, hungry. His jaw tightened slightly, because the idea of another alpha sensing that scent, of someone else approaching Lucien in such a vulnerable state, it irritated him more than it should. Adrian exhaled slowly, forcing his instincts back under control, for now. But his golden eyes darkened slightly. Tomorrow afternoon, Lucien would arrive at the palace, and Adrian suddenly realized something. That meeting was going to be far more dangerous than either of them expected. Back at the Ardent estate, Lucien stood beside the open window. Cold snowflakes drifted gently into the room. The suppressant had eased his heat slightly, but the warmth inside his body remained. Quiet, persistent. Celine crossed her arms. "You should rest." Lucien nodded. Yes. But as he looked out into the snowy night, his mind returned to one dangerous thought. An alpha king, whose instincts had already begun noticing him. And now, his heat had begun. Lucien sighed quietly. This could complicate things. H1. Strong Chapter 16. The Palace Meeting. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of pale steel. Snow drifted slowly across the capital of Veltharis, blanketing rooftops and quiet streets in soft white silence. The city looked peaceful. But Lucien Ardent knew peace rarely lasted long in a world ruled by power, especially when an Alpha King had summoned you. Lucien stepped down from his carriage at the gates of the imperial palace. The palace towered above the city like a monument to authority, vast white marble walls, golden banners fluttering against the winter wind, and rows of elite royal guards standing like statues along the grand stairway. Their eyes followed Lucien as he climbed the steps. He could feel their curiosity. An Omega noble walking alone into the king's domain. Most Omegas of high status never traveled without attendants during vulnerable cycles, but Lucien walked calmly, gracefully. His silver hair moved softly with the wind, the dark coat wrapped around his slender figure, giving him an air of cold elegance. Yet beneath that composed exterior, his heat had not fully subsided. The suppressant had dulled the fire inside him, but the warmth still lingered beneath his skin like a slow-burning ember. Lucien inhaled the cold air slowly. Focus. This meeting would shape the future of House Ardent, and possibly the entire empire. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was different, warmer, heavier. The scent of alphas filled the long marble corridors. Soldiers, nobles, advisors. But one scent stood above the rest. Strong, dominant, cedarwood and smoke. Lucien recognized it instantly. Adrian Blackthorn, the Alpha King. Lucien's pulse quickened slightly. Not fear, awareness. A servant led him through a maze of grand hallways until they stopped before a pair of enormous black doors. "The royal study," the servant said quietly. Lucien nodded. The doors opened. The room beyond was vast but quiet. Tall windows allowed pale winter sunlight to spill across the polished floors. Shelves of ancient books lined the walls. Maps of the empire covered a large table near the center. And standing near the window was the king. Adrian Blackthorn stood with his back partially turned, looking out across the palace gardens. Even without facing him, his presence filled the entire room. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair falling loosely around his face. The moment Lucien stepped inside, Adrian turned. Golden eyes met violet, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Adrian smelled it, even through the suppressants, the faintest trace of Omega heat. Jasmine, rain, soft but unmistakable. His alpha instincts reacted immediately. Something deep in his chest tightened. Possessive, alert, hungry. Lucien noticed the subtle shift in Adrian's posture. His instincts had clearly detected it. Lucien bowed politely. "Your Majesty." Adrian didn't respond at first. Instead, he slowly walked closer, each step measured, controlled, yet there was something more primal beneath the calm surface. "You shouldn't have come." Lucien raised an eyebrow. "You summoned me." Adrian stopped only a few steps away. "Yes." His golden eyes studied Lucien carefully. "But you're in heat." Lucien didn't deny it. "Yes." The honesty surprised Adrian slightly. Most Omegas would have hidden it. Lied, pretended. Lucien simply acknowledged it. Adrian exhaled slowly. "You realize how dangerous that is?" Lucien tilted his head slightly. "For whom?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "For both of us." Lucien smiled faintly. "That depends on your self-control." For a moment, the king laughed. Low, dark. Lucien's voice remained calm. "I'm practical." The silence between them grew thicker. Lucien could feel Adrian's pheromones spreading through the room. Warm, dominant, commanding. The scent wrapped around Lucien's senses, making the warmth in his body pulse stronger. Lucien's fingers tightened slightly at his side. Adrian noticed. "You're struggling." Lucien exhaled softly. "Only slightly." Adrian stepped closer again, too close now. Lucien could see the faint scar along Adrian's jawline, could feel the heat radiating from his body. Adrian spoke quietly. "You should have stayed home." Lucien's violet eyes remained steady. "And appear weak in front of the Empire?" Adrian studied him carefully. "You care that much about appearances?" "No." Then he added calmly, "But power respects strength." Adrian's expression shifted slightly. For the first time, he saw something deeper in Lucien's gaze. Not just intelligence, not just ambition, but something colder. A survivor's determination. Someone who had lived through something terrible. Someone who refused to ever be powerless again. Adrian's voice softened slightly. "You're different from other Omegas." Lucien smiled faintly. "That's what people usually say before they underestimate me." Adrian's lips curved. "Oh, I'm not underestimating you." Then he stepped even closer, close enough that Lucien could feel the king's breath. Adrian's voice dropped into a low murmur. "I'm trying very hard not to claim you." The words hung heavy in the air. Lucien's heartbeat stumbled for a moment. Not fear, not quite excitement, something more complicated. Lucien slowly looked up at him. "And why would you want to?" Adrian's golden eyes darkened. "Because every instinct in my body says you belong beside me." The words were dangerous, possessive, honest. Lucien remained silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Instincts are unreliable." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "And strategy?" Lucien's smile returned. "Strategy is far more useful." Adrian studied him for a moment longer. Then he laughed softly again. "You're fascinating, Lucien Ardent. Calm." "So I've been told." But inside, he could feel it. Something had changed between them. Something deeper than politics. Something older than reason. Alpha, Omega, instinct. And neither of them had fully realized yet how powerful that connection would become. Chapter 17. The Palace Meeting. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of pale steel. Snow drifted slowly across the capital of Valtheris, blanketing rooftops and quiet streets in soft white silence. The city looked peaceful, but Lucien Ardent knew peace rarely lasted long in a world ruled by power, especially when an Alpha King had summoned you. Lucien stepped down from his carriage at the gates of the imperial palace. The palace towered above the city like a monument to authority, vast white marble walls, golden banners fluttering against the winter wind, and rows of elite royal guards standing like statues along the grand stairway. Their eyes followed Lucien as he climbed the steps. He could feel their curiosity. An Omeaga noble, walking alone into the king's domain. Most Omegas of high status never traveled without attendants during vulnerable cycles. But Lucien walked calmly, gracefully. His silver hair moved softly with the wind, the dark coat wrapped around his slender figure, giving him an air of cold elegance. Yet beneath that composed exterior, his heat had not fully subsided. The suppressant had dulled the fire inside him, but the warmth still lingered beneath his skin like a slow-burning ember. Lucien inhaled the cold air slowly. Focus. This meeting would shape the future of House Ardent, and possibly the entire empire. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was different, warmer, heavier. The scent of alphas filled the long marble corridors. Soldiers, nobles, advisors, but one scent stood above the rest. Strong, dominant, cedarwood and smoke. Lucien recognized it instantly. Adrian Blackthorn, the Alpha King. Lucien's pulse quickened slightly, not fear. A servant led him through a maze of grand hallways until they stopped before a pair of enormous black doors. "The royal study," the servant said quietly. Lucien nodded. The doors opened. The room beyond was vast but quiet. Tall windows allowed pale winter sunlight to spill across the polished floors. Shelves of ancient books lined the walls. Maps of the empire covered a large table near the center. And standing near the window was the king. Adrian Blackthorn stood with his back partially turned, looking out across the palace gardens. Even without facing him, his presence filled the entire room. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair falling loosely around his face. The moment Lucien stepped inside, Adrian turned. Golden eyes met violet, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Adrian smelled it, even through the suppressants, the faintest trace of Omeaga heat. Jasmine, rain, soft but unmistakable. His alpha instincts reacted immediately. Something deep in his chest tightened, possessive, alert, hungry. Lucien noticed the subtle shift in Adrian's posture. His instincts had clearly detected it. Lucien bowed politely. "Your Majesty." Adrian didn't respond at first. Instead, he slowly walked closer, each step measured, controlled. Yet there was something more primal beneath the calm surface. "You shouldn't have come." Lucien raised an eyebrow. "You summoned me." Adrian stopped only a few steps away. "Yes." His golden eyes studied Lucien carefully. "But you're in heat." Lucien didn't deny it. "Yes." The honesty surprised Adrian slightly. Most Omegas would have hidden it, lied, pretended. Lucien simply acknowledged it. Adrian exhaled slowly. "You realize how dangerous that is?" Lucien tilted his head slightly. "For whom?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "For both of us." Lucien smiled faintly. "That depends on your self-control." For a moment, the king laughed, low, dark. "You're bold." Lucien's voice remained calm. "I'm practical." The silence between them grew thicker. Lucien could feel Adrian's pheromones spreading through the room. Warm, dominant, commanding. The scent wrapped around Lucien's senses, making the warmth in his body pulse stronger. Lucien's fingers tightened slightly at his side. Adrian noticed. "You're struggling." Lucien exhaled softly, only slightly. Adrian stepped closer again, too close now. Lucien could see the faint scar along Adrian's jawline, could feel the heat radiating from his body. Adrian spoke quietly. "You should have stayed home." Lucien's violet eyes remained steady. "And appear weak in front of the Empire?" Adrian studied him carefully. "You care that much about appearances?" Lucien shook his head. "No." Then he added calmly, "But power respects strength." Adrian's expression shifted slightly. For the first time, he saw something deeper in Lucien's gaze. Not just intelligence, not just ambition, but something colder, a survivor's determination. Someone who had lived through something terrible. Someone who refused to ever be powerless again. Adrian's voice softened slightly. "You're different from other Omegas." Lucien smiled faintly. "That's what people usually say before they underestimate me." Adrian's lips curved. "Oh, I'm not underestimating you." Then he stepped even closer. Close enough that Lucien could feel the king's breath. Adrian's voice dropped into a low murmur. "I'm trying very hard not to claim you." The words hung heavy in the air. Lucien's heartbeat stumbled for a moment. Not fear, not quite excitement, something more complicated. Lucien slowly looked up at him. "And why would you want to?" Adrian's golden eyes darkened. "Because every instinct in my body says you belong beside me." The words were dangerous, possessive, honest. Lucien remained silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Instincts are unreliable." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "And strategy?" Lucien's smile returned. "Strategy is far more useful." Adrian studied him for a moment longer. Then he laughed softly again. "You're fascinating, Lucien Ardent. Calm. So I've been told." But inside, he could feel it. Something had changed between them. Something deeper than politics. Something older than reason. Alpha, Omega, instinct. And neither of them had fully realized yet how powerful that connection would become. Chapter 18. The Bond That Shouldn't Exist. The air inside the royal study had grown unbearably warm. Lucien could feel it. The suppressant he had taken earlier was fading faster than expected, and the presence of a powerful alpha only made the heat inside his body more restless. His breathing had become slower, more controlled. But his senses were painfully sharp. The scent of cedarwood and smoke surrounded him. Adrian. The king stood only a few steps away, yet the tension between them filled the entire room. Adrian had not moved for several seconds, but his golden eyes had grown darker, more focused. He could smell the Omega heat clearly now. Lucien's scent of jasmine had grown deeper and sweeter as the suppressants weakened. It stirred something primal inside Adrian, an instinct older than civilization, older than kingdoms, the instinct of an alpha finding his Omega. Adrian clenched his fist slightly. He had spent his entire life mastering control. A king who ruled an empire could not allow instincts to command him. Yet every breath he took made restraint more difficult. Lucien noticed. Of course he did. His violet eyes watched Adrian carefully. "Your Majesty," Lucien said softly. Adrian didn't answer. Lucien tilted his head slightly. "You're thinking too loudly." That finally broke the silence. Adrian laughed quietly. "You can read people well." Lucien's expression remained calm. "I've had practice." Adrian walked toward the window again, forcing distance between them. Cold winter light spilled across his shoulders. But the distance didn't help. Lucien's scent still reached him. Adrian exhaled slowly. "You're doing this intentionally." Lucien raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" Adrian glanced back at him. "Provoking my instincts." Lucien leaned lightly against the desk. "I'm standing still." Adrian's lips curved slightly. "That's exactly the problem." The silence returned. But it was different now. Heavier. Charged with something neither of them could fully ignore. Lucien's heat pulsed again, a quiet ache spreading through his body. He closed his eyes briefly, just for a moment. Adrian noticed immediately. "You're worse." Lucien opened his eyes again. Still manageable. Adrian's patience finally snapped. He crossed the room in 2 quick steps. Lucien barely had time to react before Adrian's hand caught his wrist again. Firm, warm, possessive. Lucien inhaled sharply. The sudden contact sent a wave of heat through his body. Adrian's voice dropped into a low growl. "You're lying." Lucien tried to pull his hand back, but Adrian's grip held steady. "Your Majesty, you're burning up." Lucien forced his voice to remain steady. "That's what heat does." Adrian stared at him. Then he said quietly, "Why didn't you bring an alpha?" Lucien froze. Any Omega in heat would have brought a partner. Lucien's expression hardened slightly. "I don't rely on anyone." Adrian studied him carefully. For the first time since they met, something softer appeared in the king's gaze. "You should." Lucien laughed quietly. "Trust is a luxury." Adrian stepped closer. "Not always." Lucien shook his head. "In my experience it usually is." For a moment, the room fell silent again. Then Adrian did something unexpected. He released Lucien's wrist. The sudden absence of contact made Lucien strangely aware of the cold air again. Adrian stepped back, but his gaze remained fixed on Lucien. "You're right." Lucien blinked slightly. "About what?" Adrian crossed his arms. "This situation is dangerous." Lucien nodded. "Yes." Adrian continued slowly, "But not for the reasons you think." Lucien frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Adrian's golden eyes gleamed. "I've met hundreds of nobles." He stepped closer again. "Thousands of people." Another step. "But none of them ever made me lose control." Lucien felt his heartbeat quicken slightly. Adrian stopped directly in front of him again. "And yet," his voice dropped to a quiet murmur, "you walked into my palace while in heat." Lucien swallowed softly. "And suddenly I'm considering breaking every rule I've ever followed." Lucien looked up at him slowly. "Your Majesty." Adrian leaned closer. "Do you know what that means?" Lucien answered carefully. "That you lack discipline?" Adrian laughed again. "You really are fearless." Then his expression turned serious. "It means something rare is happening." Lucien's voice lowered. "And what is that?" Adrian's golden eyes held his gaze. "A bond." Lucien's breath caught slightly. Adrian continued, "The kind that forms between an alpha and omega who are meant to find each other." Lucien shook his head immediately. "That's impossible." Adrian tilted his head. "Why?" Lucien's voice was firm. "Because bonds like that aren't real." Adrian smiled slowly. "Then explain why I can't stop thinking about you." Lucien fell silent. Adrian stepped closer one final time. Close enough that Lucien could feel the warmth of his breath against his skin. His voice softened. "You walked into my life 2 days ago." His hand lifted slightly, but stopped just before touching Lucien's face. "And now every instinct I have says you belong with me." Lucien's heart was racing now, but his voice remained steady. "Instincts aren't destiny." Adrian's smile deepened. "No." Then he whispered, "But sometimes they're the beginning of it." Outside the palace, snow fell quietly across the capital, but inside the royal study, a bond that should not exist, between an alpha king and the villain Omega who refused to submit to anyone. Chapter 19. The Choice Between Power and Love. Snow had stopped falling by the time Lucien left the imperial palace. The sky above Beltharis was now clear, pale blue stretching across the cold winter horizon. Yet Lucien felt no peace in that calm sky, because the conversation inside the royal study still echoed in his mind. A bond. Adrian's words lingered like a shadow. Lucien sat quietly inside his carriage as it rolled through the capital streets. His gloved fingers rested lightly on his knee, but his thoughts were moving faster than ever. Bonds between alphas and omegas were rare, not impossible, but extremely uncommon. And when they did happen, they were powerful, instinctive, unbreakable. Lucien closed his eyes briefly. No, he refused to believe that something so irrational could control his future. He had lived one life already. He had died once. He had watched power destroy everything around him. This second life was supposed to be different. This time Lucien had promised himself one thing: never lose control again. And love, especially with an alpha king, was the fastest way to lose control. The carriage stopped at the Ardent estate. Lucien stepped down slowly. The cold air helped clear his thoughts slightly. But the warmth inside his body had still not completely faded. His heat had weakened, but the effects lingered. Inside the estate, Celine was already waiting. She stood near the staircase, arms crossed. Her crimson eyes immediately locked onto him. Lucien removed his coat calmly. "The meeting went well," he said. Celine narrowed her eyes. "That's not what I meant." Lucien walked past her toward the study. "The king is intelligent," Lucien said. Celine followed him. "And?" she asked. Lucien poured himself a glass of water. "And ambitious," he added. Celine rolled her eyes. "You're avoiding the question," she said. Lucien looked at her. Celine leaned closer. "Did he touch you?" Lucien hesitated for half a second. Celine groaned. "He did," Lucien sighed softly. "Yes." Celine pinched the bridge of her nose. "I knew it." Lucien raised an eyebrow. "You're overreacting." Celine pointed at him. "You smell like him." Celine continued. "And he smells like you." Lucien exhaled slowly. That was concerning. Scent mixing between alphas and omegas usually meant one thing. Their instincts had begun responding to each other. Celine's voice softened slightly. "Brother." Lucien looked up. Celine rarely used that tone. "You should be careful." Lucien smiled faintly. "I always am." Celine shook her head. "No." Her crimson eyes were serious now. "You're careful with politics." She stepped closer. "But emotions." Lucien didn't respond. "I don't trust the king." Lucien looked out the window. Neither did he. But that wasn't the problem. The real danger was something else entirely. The way Adrien had looked at him. The way Lucien himself had not stepped away. Across the city, inside the imperial palace, Adrien stood alone in the royal training courtyard. His sword sliced cleanly through the cold air again and again. Each movement powerful, precise, controlled. But his mind wasn't focused on the training. It kept returning to the same image. Silver hair, violet eyes, the scent of jasmine, Lucien ardent. Adrien lowered his sword finally. A royal guard approached carefully. "Your Majesty." Adrien didn't turn. "Yes." "The council meeting begins shortly." Adrien nodded. "I'll attend." The guard bowed and left. But Adrien remained standing there. His golden eyes looked toward the distant city. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Lucien was returning to his estate, and for the first time in years, Adrien felt something unusual. Uncertainty. Kings ruled through strength, through strategy, through absolute authority. But bonds were something different. They couldn't be commanded. They couldn't be controlled. They simply existed. Adrien exhaled slowly. "If this is a bond," his voice was quiet, "then the Empire may have a problem. Because if the bond became real, the king of the Empire might choose something more dangerous than power." That night, Lucien stood alone on the balcony of the Ardent estate. The city lights flickered softly below. Cold wind brushed against his hair. He looked toward the distant palace, the place where everything had changed. Lucien had built his entire second life around one goal: power, control, freedom, never again being weak, never again being destroyed by the ambitions of others. But now, one man had entered the board, and suddenly the entire game felt different. Lucien whispered quietly into the cold night air. "Power." Then he looked toward the palace again. Or love. For the first time since his reincarnation, Lucien wasn't sure which path he would choose. Chapter 20. The King, the Omeaga, and their Child. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow that once covered the rooftops of Veltharis melted into quiet rivers along the streets. Flowers began blooming in the palace gardens, soft colors returning to a city that had spent months under cold skies. But the greatest change had not come from the seasons. It had come from a decision, a choice made by two men who had once stood on opposite sides of power. Months had passed since Lucien's meeting with the king, and the rumors spreading across the empire had only grown stronger. The Alpha King and the Omega Duke had been seen together again. Council meetings, royal banquets, military strategy sessions. Lucien Ardent had slowly become a constant presence inside the imperial palace. At first, the nobles had believed it was political. The Ardent family controlled important territories. Lucien himself had proven to be an extraordinary strategist. His advice strengthened the empire. His alliances stabilized trade routes. His plans helped the kingdom avoid several potential conflicts. But eventually, the nobles began noticing something else. The way the king looked at him. The way Lucien stood beside the throne during important gatherings. The subtle scent that lingered in the air when the two of them were near each other. Cedarwood and jasmine. Inside the royal council chamber, the empire's most powerful nobles gathered for another meeting. Maps covered the central table. Generals discussed border movements. Advisors debated trade agreements. And sitting beside the throne, Lucien listened quietly. His silver hair caught the sunlight from the tall windows, and his violet eyes moved calmly between the speaking nobles. Across from him, Celine leaned against one of the marble pillars. Her crimson gaze watched everything with quiet amusement. Because this was exactly what her brother had planned. Power, influence, control over the future of the empire. But even Celine had not predicted one thing. The way the king's hand rested lightly on the armrest of Lucien's chair. Close enough to touch, not quite touching, but clearly belonging there. When the meeting finally ended, the nobles slowly left the chamber. Lucien gathered the documents from the table. Adrien approached him quietly. "You handled the council well." Lucien smiled slightly. "They're predictable." Adrien leaned against the table beside him. "Most people are." Lucien glanced up. Their eyes met. The tension between them was no longer uncertain. It had grown into something steady, something real. Lucien spoke softly. "The empire is stabilizing." Adrien nodded. "Yes." Then he added quietly, "Because of you." Lucien looked away slightly. "You're still the king." Adrien's voice softened. "But you're the one who chose to stand beside me." Lucien didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. Spring sunlight illuminated the blooming trees outside. The world looked peaceful, for once. Lucien finally spoke. "I told you before." Adrien raised an eyebrow. "Told me what?" Lucien smiled faintly. "Instincts aren't destiny." Adrien stepped closer. "And yet here you are." Lucien looked back at him. Their faces were only inches apart now. Lucien's voice was quiet. "Yes." Then he added, "But this time, it was my choice." Adrien's golden eyes softened. That answer meant more than any declaration. Lucien Ardent had chosen him, not because of instinct, not because of power, but because he wanted to. Later that evening, the palace gardens were quiet. Lucien sat beneath a blooming tree near the small royal lake. Soft petals drifted through the warm spring air. Adrien stood beside him, one arm resting around Lucien's shoulders. The world felt calm in a way neither of them had ever experienced before. Lucien rested his head lightly against Adrien's shoulder. Something small moved in his arms, wrapped in soft blankets. A baby. Their child. The tiny infant slept peacefully, soft silver hair already visible against the blanket. Adrien looked down at the child with quiet wonder. "When he grows up," Lucien raised an eyebrow. "Yes?" Adrien smiled slightly. "He's going to cause chaos." Lucien laughed softly. "That sounds likely." Adrien gently brushed a finger against the baby's tiny hand. The child stirred slightly, but continued sleeping. Lucian watched them quietly. This moment felt surreal. A second life, a second chance, a future he had never expected. Lucian whispered softly, "Adrian." The king looked at him. "Yes?" Lucian's violet eyes held warmth now, instead of cold calculation. "Do you regret it?" Adrian frowned slightly. "Regret? What?" Lucian glanced down at the baby, then back up at him. "Choosing love over power." Adrian laughed quietly. Then he leaned down and kissed Lucian gently. When he pulled back, his golden eyes were bright. "I didn't choose one over the other." Lucian tilted his head. "No?" Adrian smiled. "I chose both." He looked toward the palace behind them, the empire they ruled, then back at the child sleeping peacefully between them, the family they had built. "The king," Adrian said softly. "The Omeaga." His arm tightened slightly around Lucian. "And their child." Lucian closed his eyes briefly, letting the warm spring wind brush against his face. For the first time across 2 lifetimes, he felt truly at peace.